You've probably seen headlines like this before. The government just wasted billions on something ridiculous, all while the country is supposedly drowning in debt. People get angry, they panic, and honestly, it sounds terrifying. But then you zoom out. India has debt, Germany has debt, Switzerland has debt, Qatar has debt. Even the richest and most disciplined economies on Earth borrow money. Japan owes roughly twice the size of its entire economy. And the United States? Over $36 trillion in debt, and still climbing. So a simple question naturally follows. If debt is so dangerous, why does almost every country have it? Why don't governments just print unlimited money? If countries owe money, who are they borrowing from? And if everyone is in debt, who's actually getting paid? It sounds like a simple question, but the deeper you go, the stranger it gets. Because modern debt doesn't move in straight lines, it moves in loops. It circulates through the global economy like blood through veins. And whether you realize it or not, you may already be part of that system. So what does it actually mean when we say a country is in debt? At its core, national debt is simply the money a central government owes, not personal debt, not credit cards, not mortgages, and not local debt from states or cities. When people say the U.S. owes $36 trillion, they're talking about the federal government. And just like individuals, governments earn money mainly through taxes. But they also spend money on education, healthcare, infrastructure, defense, welfare, and emergencies. Sometimes they spend more than they earn. That gap is called a budget deficit. And when that happens, governments have three options. They can cut spending, which voters hate. They can raise taxes, which voters also hate. Or they can borrow money. In the short term, borrowing is the least painful option. So they borrow. At this point, a lot of people ask the same question. If governments control their own currency, why don't they just print money and pay everything off? Because history already showed us what happens when they do. When too much money floods the economy, each unit of currency loses value. Prices rise, savings shrink, trust begins to break. Push it far enough, and inflation turns into hyperinflation. That's what happened in places like Venezuela and Zimbabwe, where people needed stacks of cash just to buy basic food. But the real danger isn't just rising prices. It's lost confidence. Once investors stop trusting a currency, capital leaves, exchange rates collapse, and the economy can freeze. So printing money isn't a free solution. It's a last resort. Borrowing, on the other hand, comes with discipline. Debt has interest. Interest forces governments to make choices. And financial markets decide who borrows cheaply and who doesn't. That's why most governments rely on debt instead of unlimited money printing. Which leads to the next question. Who is lending trillions of dollars to governments in the first place? When people hear about national debt, they often imagine a shadowy group pulling the strings behind the scenes. But the reality is both simpler and more unsettling. Governments borrow money by issuing bonds. A bond is just a promise. You give the government money today, they promise to pay it back later, with interest. So who buys these bonds? First, people inside the country. Citizens, banks, pension funds, insurance companies, investment funds. When you put money into a bank, it doesn't sit in a vault. Banks invest it. And one of the safest investments they can make is government debt. So even if you've never bought a bond yourself, your savings may already be lending money to your government. In some countries, even government agencies buy government bonds. In other words, the government lends money to itself. Second, foreign lenders. Investors and governments from other countries also buy bonds. Not out of charity, but because bonds from stable countries are seen as safe places to park money and earn interest. That's why countries like Japan and China hold hundreds of billions of dollars in U.S. government debt. But weaker countries don't get that privilege. If investors don't trust a government's ability to repay, they either demand much higher interest or refuse to lend at all. And finally, central banks. Central banks can buy government bonds to stabilize markets and control interest rates. But overusing this tool risks devaluing the currency. So even central banks walk a careful line. Now pause for a moment. If a large share of government debt is held by its own citizens, banks, and institutions, that means in many ways, countries are borrowing from themselves. Money flows from savers, to banks, to government spending, and back into the economy, which changes how we think about debt. Because global debt isn't just a pile of unpaid bills waiting to explode. It's a circulating system, a system that only works as long as money keeps moving. And that leads to a much bigger question. If the world owes $300 trillion and everyone is borrowing from everyone else. What happens if lending stops? So if governments keep borrowing, how do they ever pay the debt back? Here's the uncomfortable truth. Most governments don't really pay off their debt. They roll it over. When old debt comes due, they issue new debt to replace it. In other words, they borrow again to pay back what they borrowed before. It sounds reckless, almost like a financial Ponzi scheme. But this is actually the foundation of the modern global economy. As long as investors believe a government will keep functioning, keep collecting taxes, and keep growing its economy, they're willing to keep lending. Debt doesn't disappear, it just keeps moving. This system works surprisingly well for wealthy and stable countries. Countries like the United States, Germany, Switzerland, or Japan. Their bonds are considered safe, which means they can borrow at relatively low interest rates. Low interest makes debt easier to manage, easier to roll over, and easier to live with. But for poorer or less stable countries, the story is very different. They borrow at much higher interest rates, and over time, those interest payments pile up. Debt starts feeding on itself. This is how countries fall into what's known as a debt trap. They're no longer borrowing to build or grow. They're borrowing just to survive, just to pay interest on old loans. Countries like Sri Lanka and Pakistan experienced exactly this. In Sri Lanka's case, the government eventually ran out of options. In 2022, it defaulted. That single word, default, meant mass protests, fuel shortages, food shortages, and economic chaos. So if debt can spiral out of control like this, why does the world keep doing it? Because debt doesn't just fund governments. Debt fuels growth. When governments borrow and spend, that money flows into the economy. Businesses earn more. Workers get paid. Those workers spend their income, which creates more demand, more jobs, and more tax revenue. That feedback loop is one of the main engines of economic growth. In China, nearly 1 out of every 5 yuan the government spends is borrowed. In the United States, it's closer to 1 out of every $4. That's roughly the same amount the U.S. spends on education and welfare combined. Now imagine what would happen if governments suddenly stopped borrowing. Spending would fall, money would stop flowing, businesses would earn less, workers would lose jobs, consumption would collapse. The same loop that grows the economy would reverse. This is why no politician wins elections promising austerity. People want governments to keep spending, and borrowing makes that possible. Sometimes borrowing isn't about growth. Sometimes it's about survival. When a crisis hits, that is a war, a financial crash, a pandemic, people stop spending. Businesses freeze, tax revenues collapse, the private sector pulls back, and the only entity left that can spend is the government. That's exactly what happened in 2020. During the COVID crisis, the U.S. government borrowed nearly $4 trillion in a single year, almost 20% of its entire economy. China, Europe, Japan, they all did the same. It wasn't optional. Without that borrowing, unemployment would have been far worse. Businesses would have collapsed, and the global recession would have been deeper. So when people ask, why doesn't the government just stop borrowing? The honest answer is simple. It can't. The modern economy was built on debt. Remove it too quickly, and the entire system starts to break. But this system isn't risk-free. As debt grows, so do interest payments. Over time, a larger share of government budgets goes toward paying old loans instead of funding new schools, hospitals, or infrastructure. Decades ago, a debt-to-GDP ratio near 100% was considered catastrophic. Today, it's considered normal. That only works when borrowing is cheap and confidence is high. But confidence can change. If investors begin to doubt a government's ability to repay, interest rates rise. Borrowing becomes more expensive. And suddenly, the math no longer works. One common response is printing more money, but that comes at a cost. When more money enters the system, each unit becomes less valuable. Prices rise, savings lose purchasing power. Inflation quietly taxes everyone. In extreme cases, it spirals out of control. In Venezuela, the government printed so much money to cover its debts that prices doubled every few weeks. Life savings were wiped out. While most countries aren't facing anything that extreme, even moderate inflation creates real pain, especially for developing nations. Many of them borrow in foreign currencies, like US dollars, which means if their own currency weakens, their debt becomes far more expensive overnight. As that burden grows, lenders lose confidence. Interest rates rise again, and eventually, the country runs out of options. That's when defaults happen. A default is the sovereign equivalent of missing your mortgage payment. Except instead of losing a house, an entire economy is at stake. And once a country defaults, no one wants to lend to it. When a system becomes this fragile, people start looking for something real, something solid. That's exactly what we're seeing right now. Record amounts of money are flowing into gold. Because gold doesn't rely on promises. It isn't backed by trust in governments or confidence in debt cycles. It exists outside the system, which makes it attractive when the system itself starts to feel unstable. And that leads to one final question. If debt is the foundation of the modern world and trust is what keeps it alive, can this cycle really continue forever? Or are the cracks already forming? So can a country ever be completely debt-free? Technically, yes. In reality, almost none are. In fact, there is no fully sovereign country on Earth today with zero national debt. The closest example people often point to is Macau. But Macau isn't a country. It's a tiny special administrative region of China with fewer than 1 million people and massive income from casinos. That model doesn't scale. You can't turn the United States, Europe, or Japan into one giant casino and pay off trillions in debt. And even if a country could eliminate its debt entirely, most governments wouldn't want to. Because debt isn't just a burden, it's a tool. If a government tried to erase all debt overnight, it would require massive spending cuts or huge tax increases. Public services would shrink, economic growth would slow, and political backlash would be immediate. But there's another consequence people rarely think about. No government debt means no government bonds. And government bonds are one of the safest investments in the financial system. Pension funds rely on them, insurance companies rely on them, retirement systems depend on them. Without bonds, those institutions would be forced into riskier assets. Markets would become more volatile, and long-term financial security would weaken. So paradoxically, a world with zero government debt might actually be less stable. This is why economists don't ask whether a country has debt. They ask whether it can manage it. Debt used wisely can help economies grow, modernize, and recover from crises. Debt used recklessly can hollow out nations from the inside. The difference isn't the number itself, it's confidence. As long as investors believe a government can grow its economy, collect taxes, and honor its promises, the system keeps moving. Money circulates, debt rolls over, and the machine keeps running. But confidence is fragile, and history shows what happens when it breaks. When investors lose faith, interest rates spike, borrowing costs explode, and governments are forced into impossible choices. Cut spending, raise taxes, or print money. None of them are painless. That's why debt crises are rarely sudden. They build slowly, quietly, until one day the math stops working. This is why so many people are paying attention right now. Why money is flowing into assets that don't depend on trust in governments. Gold, silver, hard assets. Not because the system has already collapsed, but because people are hedging against the possibility that one day it might. So when you hear that the world owes $300 trillion, it's easy to panic. But global debt isn't a ticking time bomb waiting to explode tomorrow. It's something more complicated. It's the engine of the modern world, a system built not on stability, but on motion, on borrowing, lending, and reinvesting. Over and over again. The real question isn't whether the world has too much debt. The real question is, how long can confidence keep it all moving?